Hello and welcome to Policy Watch. I have a special guest on the show this week, but before I introduce him, we'll take a quick look at the top stories this week. Mohammad Ahmed Ansari re-elected Vice President of India. He becomes only the second man in independent India to get the honour to serve as VP for consecutive terms. Ambram speaks to the media for the first time after taking charge. A deaf rejig in North Block later promises substantial initiatives within the month. GDP growth downgrades continue pouring in. Goldman Sachs, Citigroup among others slash projections. CRISIL and CLSA reports also paint a grim picture. And June IIP numbers disappoint, a dip of 1.8% as against 2.4% the previous month. We'll get Himanshu Watts of the Economic Times to break it down for us. Those are the headlines, and my guest this week is Abheek Barua, Chief Economist at HDFC. It took me a long time to convince him to come on Policy Watch, but he's here now. A very warm welcome to you, Abheek.
Pleasure to be here.
I was just, we'll go into the first story, but before that, I've been told that the Finance Minister, Ambram, yesterday in Parliament said that for this planned period, he expects growth to be around 7.6%. Optimistic?
Very optimistic, I should think, because I think for the next couple of years, we are pretty much in the ballpark of 6 to 7%. To get to 7.6% for the entire planned period entails a return to close to 9% growth in the later years of the plan. That at this stage I find a little difficult to accept. So it is certainly very optimistic to say the least.
I'd like to talk about that a little more, but that's later in the program. We'll go into our first story right away. Now, barely a fortnight since Ambram took the reins of the Finance Ministry, and the fact that the new North Block boss means business is now apparent. PC has shuffled his secretary-level babus, and a revamp in the Finance Ministry is on as the Revenue and Expenditure Secretaries swap positions and new faces in key posts have been appointed. The Finance Minister spoke to the Finance Ministry faithful for the first time since he got the portfolio this time around. We filed a story. Take a look.
R.S. Gujral held the twin posts of Finance Secretary and Revenue Secretary in the Finance Ministry till now, and his tenure saw some controversial tax decisions being enforced. The General Anti-Avoidance Rules or GAR amendment created quite a furor within industry, not to mention the various retrospective tax amendments that sought to get deals like the Vodafone Hutch deal under its purview. This is being seen as a step away from the tax enforcement regime that Gujral presided over to a more taxpayer-friendly approach that the new Finance Minister wants. And the new Finance Minister, in his first meeting with journalists, said that the deficit and investor confidence were his top priorities.
Uppermost in my mind is the duty to regain the confidence of all stakeholders. Obviously, where necessary, our policies have to be modified or fine-tuned in order to meet the expectations of different stakeholders. We intend to unveil shortly a path of fiscal consolidation. I would like to make it clear that the burden of fiscal correction must be shared fairly and equitably.
We have a lot of expectations and hopes from Mr. Chidambaram because of the reputation that he carries, which is formidable, and he's in the past always risen to the occasion. And we think that the kind of focus and energy that he brings to the job is actually quite exemplary and uncomparable.
Indications that the Finance Ministry will take a relook at significant tax issues were already given when Parthasarathy Shom, a former aide to the FM, was appointed by the Prime Minister to head a committee to write the final draft on GAR with industry feedback. The former chairman of the Central Board of Direct Taxes CBDT, N. Rangachari, was also brought back to head a committee on tax issues in the IT sector. Industry on its part seems enthused about the revamp. Chief Economic Advisor Kaushik Basu's term expires soon as well, and Chidambaram is expected to name his replacement as well. Raghuram Rajan, former advisor to the PM, is the frontrunner for this particular post.
Absolutely, it's the step in the right direction, and I hope there will be many more steps, because one step, or as they say, one swallow doesn't make a summer. So we need more. Given where we are, we need not just one but a series of steps in the right direction for the investors' confidence to come back.
The new Revenue Secretary is an experienced hand and has held the expenditure and divestment subdivisions in the past. But he will have his task cut out as expectations will be high. Bose will be expected to preside over the Direct Taxes Code Bill scheduled to be introduced in the monsoon session after incorporating the suggestions by the Standing Committee on Finance. The new Revenue Secretary will also have to bring momentum back into consultations over the Goods and Services Tax Bill or GST.
The new look North Bloc has its task cut out, cutting the deficit, bringing investor confidence back and presenting a taxpayer-friendly image seems to be on top of the agenda. And with the new finance minister's old team back in place, expect some major announcements in the days to come. With Athar Khan, Rahul Kapoor for Rajya Sabha TV.
Abheek, the biggest challenge for Mr. Chidambaram is certainly going to be demonstrating his ability to push key reforms like land reforms, taxation, labour as well, also government expenditure, because that's really the key to growth in the medium term. Would you agree?
Absolutely. And I think I would put at this in the short term, pairing government expenditure, particularly through pruning subsidies, as priority number one. And that's the most difficult bit. I think all bills are likely to be contentious, but I think what pruning subsidies entails is a hike in fuel prices. And that is a political hot potato.
And that's something the government hasn't wanted to do. I mean, they haven't really touched it for a while.
Right, well, they possibly can't, but unless they sort of bite that bullet, nothing much is going to change substantially.
This particular overhaul in the finance ministry is significant, mostly because Mr. Gujral, who was finance secretary, who is still finance secretary, did preside over some controversial decisions, including GAR as well, and some retrospective tax amendments to bring cases like Vodafone under its ambit. Is this now, Abheek, a conscious attempt at presenting an image that is more taxpayer-friendly, more investor-friendly?
I should think so. And as your clip showed, Mr. Chidambaram mentioned that his sort of principal task is to regain the confidence of all stakeholders. The two stakeholders in this case who are likely to have their sort of confidence boosted, if you like, would be foreign investors who were sort of affected by some of the proposed rules in the GAR, and of course industry, which sort of was looking at this retrospective taxation as a huge problem going forward. So, I mean, that's the bit that this rejig or reshuffle addresses.
Right. GAR, particularly if you talk about it, has been now passed on to a subcommittee. The Prime Minister did that immediately after he took over the Finance Ministry when Pranab Mukherjee resigned. Now, the committee will now look into concerns of investors afresh. That's what the government says. This would have pacified industry to some extent, wouldn't you think?
Yes, absolutely. I think there's been a very concerted effort to send a signal that whatever was perceived to be unsavory about the GAR would be addressed. And I think the entire sort of package of measures from the rejig at North Bloc to the subcommittee to Dr. Shom coming in and looking at things, all sort of are addressed at assuaging certain concerns. And to a certain extent, I would expect that to work.
Right. Eventually, when GAR is implemented, and staying on GAR because it's an important issue that has cropped up over the weeks, whenever GAR is implemented, next year in this case, will we now see a much watered down version of what was originally drafted and penned by Mr. Gujral under Pranab Mukherjee? Do you expect that to happen at all?
I should think so. I think some form of GAR will certainly come in. But compared to the avatar that we saw in the budget, it will be a much more sort of watered down, taxpayer friendly version, which perhaps would be in terms of revenue gathering not as effective, but certainly in sort of addressing the concerns of both Indian corporates and international investors.
I was speaking to Bimal Jalan, the ex-RBI governor, the other day, and I asked him what the biggest priority before Mr. Chidambaram could be when he became finance minister, and he said, make the tax laws of the country clear. Retrospective amendments in tax laws would hurt in the long run. Your comments on that?
No, absolutely. And although I think there are a number of instances internationally of retrospective amendments, what this was being seen as as a sort of a response to the Supreme Court judgment that had given a specific company, Vodafone, reprieve. So it was, seen in a sort of fundamental way as a dilution of India's, dilution or sort of perhaps a muddying up of India's, legal system, which was seen to be or perceived to be transparent, and suddenly this transparency was going away because you had legislative changes overturning what the courts had decided. So it was seen as a very fundamental problem that was coming about and would affect investors and companies.
Abheek, before we move on to our next story, I'd like to ask you one last question from a policy perspective. We've already talked about how difficult it is for the government to touch issues like cutting subsidies. Fertilizer subsidies are not going anywhere right now. It looks like from signals coming from the government. But the RBI has also been very clear, definitely putting the onus on the government, saying we cannot touch interest rates till you do something about your policy gridlock.
Right.
Let's assume for a minute that the government, because of political compulsions or otherwise, cannot really touch subsidies right now, cannot cut subsidies. What are the options before the government really to cut their twin deficits, to get the growth back on track?
I really don't see too many options, quite honestly, because if subsidies are not pruned, and given the fact that growth is likely to be much lower than what was budgeted, which was about 7.3%, and the fact that both expenditures will overshoot and revenues will fall below target, you're looking at a fiscal deficit overrun of roughly about a percentage of GDP, which is about 110,000 crores of additional government borrowings. Whether the RBI does anything or not doesn't really matter, because a 25 basis point repo rate cut is unlikely to offset the impact of this huge additional borrowing that hits the market. Inflation is unlikely to be tamed because you still have this huge expenditure and suppressed sort of inflationary pressures in the system. Given all this, I think I think the problem is becoming more and more complex, and by the end of this fiscal year, we'll be in a far worse sort of budgetary situation than we were at the beginning of it. So they just have to go that extra mile and get whatever the political compulsions are. They have to bite the bullet.
Do you think that P. Chidambaram is the right man in North Block at the moment? Because is he?
I think he's very fundamentally convinced about certain things. I think he's convinced about the need, for instance, for fiscal consolidation, the need for reforms.
And also the fact that he'll be a full-time finance minister is going to help. Pranab Mukherjee had 10 different things on his plate.
Yes, but I should think that his very deep commitment to a certain agenda, which was very closely associated with reforms in the earlier phase, and his sort of continuing commitment to that, does make a difference. It's the conviction that he carries that can actually make a difference when it comes to sort of negotiating with political allies and so on. And I think he brings that conviction to that table.
Right. On that note, we'll take a small break. Abheek, we'll come back with the next story. Don't go anywhere. Keep watching Policy Watch. We'll be right back with Abheek Barua. Welcome back to Policy Watch. Now, more economists have revised their outlooks for growth in India. Citigroup cut its outlook to 5.4%, Goldman Sachs to 5.7%, CLSA to 5.5% respectively in the fiscal year ending March, with a weak summer monsoon not helping things at all. Earlier, the RBI has also revised the projection to 6.5% for 2012-13 from the earlier estimate of 7.3%. CLSA further dethroned India as the second fastest growing nation in Asia after China, as according to CLSA report, India has slipped to 4th position behind Indonesia and even the Philippines now. So what should be the biggest priority for the government then? What various economists have echoed since Mr. Chidambaram took over are these catchy words and phrases: boosting investor confidence, sustaining growth, restart the reform engine, and many, many more. Abheek, that's exactly what Mr. Chidambaram echoed when we met him in room 72 on Monday. That was the first time he was speaking to the media after he became the finance minister again. Can we expect, and continuing from our earlier story, the policy gridlock? I don't like the term policy paralysis. I think it's used too randomly. The policy gridlock to sort of unlock, since the fact that he made a statement in Parliament yesterday in the upper house saying, for the plan period, 7.6 is what I'm looking at.
It's unlikely to unlock entirely because the gridlock has come about because of a fairly complex set of pulls and pressures from different directions, some of them political, some of them addressing genuine concerns of the environment, labor, land acquisition and so on. So they can't just be sort of wished away with a flick of one's fingers. But I think what can be done is, for instance, to put some projects on fast track, have continuous monitoring of these projects. These are certain things I think that...
Are we talking sectors like power, coal?
I think so. But again, I mean, to a certain extent, where for projects that have got clearances on environment, land, etc., those need to be put on the fast track. But there are projects that are stalled because of the regulatory constraints that have come about.
And they would include infra projects as well?
They would include most of the big projects which would be dominated by the infrastructure sector.
Right. So policy gridlock, power outages, and these are terms that are mentioned in the reports of CLSA and Citigroup as well. Falling domestic consumption, for example, has taken its toll on India as well. According to these projections, Abheek, there is a drought situation also in the country. Since you're here with us today, as the chief economist at HDFC, what is your policy prescription if you were to advise the team at the finance ministry? What would be the stepwise, the first top 3 steps that you would take?
I think, and this is possibly because I come from a bank, I think it's important to get the fiscal balances right. And that would also be a very important signal to a range of stakeholders across the board, from foreign investors to domestic companies and so on. It would also be a signal and a sign that the government is interested in pushing forward economic governance on more efficient lines. So I think that would be priority number 1, getting the fisc in check. Number 2 would be certain, visible measures on infrastructure. It's very difficult to sort of identify what could be done, but small steps will not work anymore. We need something of a sort of, if you like, a big bang nature, like the Central Electricity Act of 2003. Something just that says that, well, we're going to turn this thing is going to make a significant difference to infrastructure projects. Right. I think we need traction on land acquisition and environmental hurdles and the way they're going to be sort of addressed either legislatively or through executive changes. So I think these are these are cliched solutions, but I think what will make a difference is actual implementation of certain things. So we can't sort of work with just the formula anymore. I mean, the chemicals will have to be put on the test tube.
For long we've talked a good game, it's time to implement. Right. Let's talk about the RBI for a second now. The RBI has made it clear that the onus now is on the government. The Governor Subbarao really deftly put the onus on the government last time, and he kept policy rates steady. What's your outlook on the monetary policy in the near future? They've clearly said till inflation comes down, we're not touching it.
Which I think is a legitimate thing for a central bank to say, because I think the world over, inflation management of price, holding the price line is a central bank's principal remit, and it cannot sort of move away from that. And given the fact that inflation is likely to be in the ballpark of 7.5% to 8%, it's very difficult for a central bank to...
The RBI really gave a rationale behind why they kept policy rates steady. Were you okay with that rationale?
Well, if you are referring to the fact that it said that if it went in for monetary accommodation, it's likely to push up inflation without making much of a difference to growth, because there are problems on the supply side. I kind of agree with that, because I think growth is constrained to a large extent by supply bottlenecks, and we're aware of what these are.
Right.
I think the fiscal bit is also a major constraint. So unless these are sorted out, I think monetary policy will not make much of a difference, because I think it's smaller, a quarter percentage point cut in the policy rate is not going to go a long way in turning growth around. And number two, it might sort of change inflationary expectations quite considerably. We might get stuck in
It's time for another short break, Abheek. We'll come back. After the break, we'll have Himanshu Watts of the Economic Times break down the June IIP numbers for us. Don't go anywhere. Keep watching Policy Watch. Welcome back. India's factory output contracted by 1.8% in June, the third fall in 4 months. Capital goods output, considered sort of a proxy for investment activity, contracted by 27.9% in June. Now, supply-side constraints upon manufacturing and exports must be removed in double-quick time. This is what Chidambaram said, and I'm quoting him: "We need practical solutions to the problem that impede higher production or output in the coal, mining, petroleum, power, road transport, and railway and port sectors." Policy Watch spoke to the energy and infra editor at the Economic Times, Himanshu Watts. Here's what he thinks.
The June IIP numbers have shown a decline. And to talk more on this, I have with me Mr. Himanshu Watts, Senior Editor, Economic Times. Welcome to Policy Watch, sir. A shocking dip of 1.8% in the June IIP numbers. Capital goods have declined by 27%. This performance is worse than in May. Was this expected, seeing that the growth was declining from the past 5 months?
To some extent, it was expected that it's not going to be very good, but it is worse than what was expected. Most analysts and economists were expecting maybe a very modest growth, a little above 0.5%. The decline was not expected. But given the monetary stance the central bank has taken, I am not surprised. And given the inflationary pressures, the drought-like situation, I won't be surprised if this continues. Reserve Bank continues its tight policy. Because then the focus is to try and contain inflation. And while trying to contain inflation, you have to sacrifice a bit on growth. And capital goods point you specifically raised. You see, that's a sector which is generally the one that declines first and very quickly when there's a slowdown, and it's also the last to come up. So when there is a decline, a fall in capital goods is expected. And if you speak to the major companies, whether it's BHEL, L&T, and other infrastructure companies, they are all saying that the order book position is not so good.
So you made an interesting point there about the central bank. Would you agree with the criticism that has come Subha Rao's way, especially from the industry quarters? And do you think that easing of interest rates is the only way out to give momentum to growth?
See, as far as the industry criticism is concerned, they are speaking about themselves, what will benefit them. But, when the monetary authority is tightening the policy, the broader economic message given from the authority is that, look, you're growing too fast, this is not sustainable, it will lead to all kinds of inflationary and other structural problems. So to an extent, the tight monetary policy is an effort to slow down the economy so that other basics are set right. As far as industry is concerned, their prime concern is their own growth. So from their narrow perspective, they're right, but from a wider economic perspective, whether it's the monetary authority or the executive authority, they have much bigger constituency to cater to. In a bad monsoon situation, they cannot have runaway inflation. If you see the 2009 drought, it led to 20% food inflation. I don't think this country is prepared for that again. So it has to be a mixed bag, because when it comes to the way the authorities deal with the situation, whether it's the finance ministry, the political establishment, the RBI, they are not looking just at industry. They are looking at the overall economy, the benefit of the lower classes, the less privileged, underprivileged people. So they have to strike a balance, and nobody would be happy at the end of it.
Okay, so Mr. Chidambaram has taken charge of the North Block recently, and the FM said that he would be announcing some major steps soon to revive investor confidence and to boost growth. What are his options really, and what steps do you think he can take?
See, the first good thing about Mr. Chidambaram's arrival and his statement is that the industry and the investors, both domestic and foreign, they have a lot of faith in his abilities, in his track record. Even when He's been a finance minister when he was supported by the CPM, and he came out with a fairly path-breaking budget, which everybody called the dream budget. So he's a man who likes action. He's a very sharp, intelligent person, and he knows how to deal with various constituencies involved. As far as what actions he can take, there are certain reform measures. There's some fiscal discipline, some control on expenditure. There are various actions, and above all, whatever actions he takes, the market, the industry's expectation is that you take an action and stick to it and don't roll back. Because, that creates uncertainty, and that's what investors don't like.
Okay, sir, thank you so much for talking to Policy Watch. That's all we have for now, and back to you in the studio, Athar.
Thank you. Rahul Kapoor there with Himanshu Watts. That's all the time we have, Abheek. Thank you so much for joining us on Policy Watch. Sure. That was Abheek Barua and Himanshu Watts on the show. That's all the time we have. But before we go, of course, the first top story that we had today, Mr. Chidambaram coming in as finance minister, rejigging North Block. Our guests seem to believe that he is the right man for the job, and his conviction will be his biggest ally in trying and turning around things in North Block. Of course, the CLSA, CRISIL, Citibank and Goldman Sachs downgrades were sort of expected. Industry also has been in a bit of a gloomy past 3-4 months as well. But radical policy action, of course, really the only way out, of course. Abheek Barua also expects the RBI to keep rates steady till the time, of course, there is less pressure on inflation. Our third story, of course, was June IIP numbers. Like Himanshu Watts said, it wasn't really expected to be that bad, but of course has been. Again, the policy inaction on the government's part has been hurting growth as well. We'll have to see, wait and watch what Mr. Chidambaram really does with his time in North Block. That's all the time we have. Athar Khan saying goodbye, and keep watching Policy Watch.